First of all, I do want to thank Professor Sonia Pruneda Hernandez for this incredible invitation. I want to thank Montgomery College for continuing to amplify our voices when it comes to education and opportunity. I think that it is very apparent by what they do on a daily basis and how they immediately jump out at opportunities to host events like this one. It's very impressive. I want to thank the volunteers, of course, the Maryland Department of Education, the Maryland State Childcare Association, and other sponsors. And just as a point of personal privilege, I really want to acknowledge and thank the Latino Family Childcare Association. Bienvenidas y gracias por estar aquí. This is a group that's very near and dear to my heart because it's taking a lot of energy and many, many, many years to continue to do this work, so it's very special. So I was asked to come and talk to you a bit about this very important field that you're in, early care and education, and I thought that what I would do is start with sharing kind of my personal journey in this particular space and where we are today in Montgomery County, and also where I believe there are opportunities on a national level as well. So first of all, I came to the United States for the very first time when I was 10 years old. And my father, who was he worked in Venezuela's refinery for PDVSA, which is the national oil industry in Venezuela. He wanted to come to the United States to do some graduate work in that particular arena. And I, as a 9-year-old at that time, actually was just so intrigued with other children that lived in my neighborhood that spoke English, and I was just so enthralled by this language and wanted so badly to understand and learn it that when my father made this announcement and said, hey, would you guys like to move to the United States for 2 years? Of course, I jumped up and down and said, of course I do, and I'm the oldest. And so we came to Rolla, Missouri. And my father came first, and then my mom and my sister, my younger sister, and baby sister, we all came to the United States. We came to Rolla, Missouri. For some reason, somebody told my mom that it was going to be really cold, but it was summer, and so here we are in Miami shedding all these like sweaters and everything. But it was an amazing experience for me as a child to have the opportunity to learn this new language, which I learned very quickly. I remember getting a subscription to Highlights magazine and just reading it like there was no tomorrow, and then watching television, The Soul Train, and learning the dance moves while I learned the lyrics. And believe it or not, in 6 months, I was like a spelling bee champion in my school. They didn't have ESOL in that school because I was the first student that arrived there ever not knowing English, but then I had a little partner, Yom, who was a refugee from Vietnam, who joined me, and then we both helped each other. But it was an extraordinary experience, and we went back to Venezuela, of course, and then I went through middle school, high school over there, and I really wanted to come back to go to college. And so my parents said, well, wait a year. I graduated at age 16. They said, you have to be a little older. Long story short, age 17, I arrived in Columbia, Missouri, 1983, to go to college. And it was extraordinary as well. I studied psychology and business administration. I graduated. I had an opportunity to work for 3 years, and then ended up in this area, Washington, D.C., to visit some friends, to try to get a little bit more experience with a one-way ticket to Venezuela at age 24. Stayed for about 6 months, and then I met my husband here, who's originally from Haiti. He's Haitian American, and we got married, and my one-way ticket, we threw it away, and so we stayed. And we moved to Montgomery County in 1991. In 1991, found out we were going to be parents for the first time, and it was super exciting. Of course, my mother came from Venezuela to stay with me. She stayed with me for a year. And then we just bought a home in Wheaton, and she had to go back because her visa, was about to expire. And so we didn't know what to do because I thought, well, I need to now find childcare, but how do I do that? My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I don't know what that looks like. I can't do it. And so my mother convinced me to take my daughter for 3 months while we got some things, financial issues settled. And those were the longest, most excruciating 3 months of my life. I knew I was doing the right thing because I knew that my mom, who else can take care of your child better than your own mother? but at the same time, it was so excruciating to have to separate from my baby. So I went back to Venezuela to pick her up, brought her back, and then this whole exercise of trying to find out quality childcare began. First, I hired a lady that would come to my house, but then she made some comments that were really untoward regarding my daughter's skin color. So I had to get rid of her. Then I found a family childcare program, and I dropped my daughter off, and the last image I have is her kind of staring at me like, what are you doing? I drove up Georgia Avenue, made a U-turn on Georgia and Aspen Hill Road, picked her up, got in the car, called my husband and said, I'm quitting my job, and I'm staying home. And he was like, no, you can't do that, we just got a house. I was like, I don't care. But I had a plan B, and it was becoming a family child care provider. And so I very quickly laid out the whole plan, and said to him, here, this is what we're gonna do, and this is the timeline, and let's get this done. And so we literally converted our whole entire house into the program. Very fortunate that I was able to then be a family child care provider, have an amazing program. It was a bilingual program. I was able to stay with my daughter. I was able to care for these extraordinary kids that then became bilingual. And towards the end, I wanted to do it for about 3 years. I had my second baby, was able to stay, at home a little longer. But then I had this real interesting sort of dilemma and question in my head around this issue of school readiness, and then also quality childcare, and then the opportunities that were there for so many immigrant women who come to this country and began to do work in this space, but then many of them really want to be, entrepreneurs. And so all of a sudden there was this kind of like alignment of ideas around what if I work on a project to help many of these people who want to become family child care providers but don't know how to navigate the system. Many would have limited English because I would meet them at the playgrounds all the time. And, informally, I was like helping all these folks kind of like go through the process. Hey, I'll help you. And I thought, why don't we do a project? Long story short, Pilar Torres and I got together and we launched what then became Centro Familia. And I learned so much through that experience because I was able to understand sort of the landscape of early care and education in Montgomery County. I kept tracking the demographic changes in the county, and I was very much aware that this was going to be a need that was going to continue to grow. But at the county level, I kept hearing, you're ahead of your time, this is not an issue. Except that when I would go into many neighborhoods, I knew it was an issue because I was talking to folks all the time. And then I started understanding this idea of the achievement gap even closer because my oldest daughter was about to enter school here in Montgomery County, and all of a sudden I had to become an informed parent around how do you navigate the system. What is this thing, school readiness, right? Because, I come from, Venezuela, and so there it's like a different situation. And so what does that mean? And so I started doing a lot of research around this and became convinced that if there is one particular sort of stage, obviously, in a child's and a person's education where you can intervene and really make that difference, of course, we all know is the first 5 years, right? Groups of economists at the Inter-American Development Bank had published books around how in very low-income areas in Latin America, in order for you to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of poverty, early childhood is where you're able to do that. And so, of course, it just made so much sense to me that, because I'm a very practical person too, and I like to be strategic and look at return for, of investment, this is where we need to do it. Through Centro Familia, we were able to expand the availability of quality childcare slots in low-income areas by about 1,000 or so. And many of those business owners are still operating today and have been able to do extraordinary things. So it helped the economic development and economic sufficiency of many women, and it helped also enhance school readiness in so many areas. But the challenge in Montgomery County is that, this was back in 1998, this is probably, 1998, 2000, around that time. When you look now at the student population in Montgomery County, what you find is that, for example, the Latino student population now is the largest. And what you see is that in terms of ESOL students, which at this point I think we have about 17,000 or so, 70% of those students are US born. And every time I hear that statistic, what it tells me is that these are children that are not exposed to language-rich environments in the first 5 years. I'm not talking about English language-rich environment, any language-rich environment. Because we all know that if a child is exposed to music and to words and reading, etc., all those connections that are occurring in the brain continue to be reinforced, and so it's so much easier for you to learn a second language, right? So what's happening is that, lo and behold, here we have 70% of ESOL students, US born, and we're having to remediate, we're having to spend all this money, and these children are in many ways being tracked because now they're in this program. So there are so many different reasons why this is imperative and this is urgent. I will say that to me, as I then was appointed to the Board of Education in 2004, this continued to be a priority. And you heard earlier mention the name of Valerie Irvin as a council member. Valerie Irvin and I were elected to the Board of Education at the same time, but then she ran for the county council and I was at the board. And we had this really interesting partnership around this issue because, this was my area of expertise. This is something she wanted to work on. And we worked together, for example, to bring Centronía to Montgomery County. I worked at the Board of Education to release some slots. She worked on the council to get the funding. We got them here. We sat down to figure out what would be something that the council could do, and that's how this group came together. And it was a really amazing partnership, and Brad was absolutely right. We were very excited about the energy that was taking place around that time. But then it's true that the recession hit. And when the recession hit, I had just gotten elected to the Montgomery County Council. And it was very disappointing because I was so excited about the opportunity to expand many initiatives, especially in this particular space that I had worked on for so long. I forgot to mention that, Centro Familia was born in the basement of my home. literally. This is where our office was. And my husband gave us the first, printer and fax. At that time, we had faxes. And let us, print some business cards at the printer where he has his own company, so, we could use that. So it was a labor of love, and I still had this real commitment to pursuing this policy area, both at the Board of Education and then on the council. But yes, 2009, when I was elected to the Montgomery County Council as the first Latina ever in the history of the county, I realized that it was time to just roll up our sleeves and stabilize the fiscal health of the county, which meant that a lot of initiatives had to take a back seat. So that was very difficult to do, and it's something that that was always in the back of my mind in terms of what we needed to do and how we needed to be more intentional here in the county. Because what we have in Montgomery County are a lot of programs. We have a lot of different particular centers. So we have the Childcare Resource and Referral Center. We have Montgomery County Public Schools that does a lot of work around Head Start and some pre-K. Of course, we have a network of family child care providers, private centers, community centers. We have Montgomery College that offers extraordinary training and support. So we have a lot of different pieces. We have not had a particular initiative that's coherent and that is strategic. And a lot of it had to do with this question of resources. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But there was one experience that solidified a lot of particular things for me. It clarified many things for me. So I want to share that with you. And as a preamble, I will share that when I was running Centro Familia, I was I participated in this Childcare action campaign. So I was a member of that group. We went to New York for a meeting, and I happened by accident to share a cab with this lady who was then the president of the American Federation of Teachers, the national union. And so we're talking, and she says, well, what do you do? And I say, oh, well, you know, I co-founded this nonprofit organization that works on issues of early care and education and family child care, and we do this, and it's in the immigrant community, and blah, 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 and we're so proud, and it's just so cool. And she literally looked at me and said, you know, people like you and those types of organizations, it's what's wrong with, you know, with the early care and education field and space. And I thought, can I just like punch her and throw her out of the cab? How rude, right? I mean, come on, you know. And then she continued to say, you know, I don't want to be rude, although she had been. But she explained, you know, how all around the country, there are so many small efforts, right? There are so many nonprofit organizations working in this field, or maybe, you know, a jurisdiction launches an initiative and there's like, yeah, with a glossy brochure and a booklet, and then you look at how many children are you serving, and you compare that to the scope of the need, and it's just a drop in the bucket, right? And so I understood where she was coming from. I mean, it stayed with me, right? That maybe because we all want to do something, we do what we can, but in that process, what we're doing actually is enabling, especially government, enabling them to not scale up and really make the investment that's necessary to turn, you know, to move the needle, right? So I understood that, and, you know, I said, well, thank you for the feedback. I'll keep that in mind. But then in 2011, I was really honored to be appointed to President Obama's Commission on Excellence for Education, Hispanic education. And so I immediately, you know, said that I would volunteer to be in the subgroup that deals with early childhood. And so with that, what we did is that we traveled the country. We held an incredible summit in Miami focusing on this issue of private sector support for this policy area. But as I traveled the country, and as I served on this commission that was just so prestigious and so amazing, because the people that were there as commissioners were like top-notch folks from all over the place with all different industries, I literally walked away from that experience with two takeaways. One is that our early care and education agenda needs to be reframed. Our narrative needs to change. We all care about children. We all know that, right? We love children. We feel like it is such a moral imperative that, you know, we should have investments. You know, as women, we want to fight hard for that. Inevitably, what has happened is that in terms of policy, this has been perceived as an individual responsibility issue, right? So you decide to have children, you need to pay for the care and the first 5 years, right? So it's an individual responsibility, which then translates into governments should not be investing in this. Parents need to figure out how to pay for it. And so after serving there and after going to so many different, you know, meetings and summits and reading research and listening to presenters, I concluded that we need to reframe and change the narrative because in reality, yes, it is all those things, but primarily it is an economic imperative for this country. So during the recession, many economists came together, and one of the things that they observed is that of all the developed countries in the world that were facing this horrible, you know, global recession, all the developed countries had an aging population, and that was a concern, right? How are you going to recover? How are you going to set yourself for in order to be competitive? The only country that has an aging population and also a young population is the United States, right? Now, of course, when you look at that young population, you do observe something. The majority of those children are children of color, and that is growing. So logic tells you that if those are the same children who right now are disproportionately affected by this academic achievement gap, how are we going to maintain our competitive edge in the United States if we don't make sure that all children, but especially those who are not doing so well, are able to achieve at their highest potential, right? Because they are our workforce. And so we need to start framing this issue of early childhood education as an economic imperative, because that's what it begins, right? If you don't invest in those early years and literally equip these children with all the tools they need to be able to succeed and to be able to adapt to these new jobs, because the job world, is changing dramatically on a daily basis. And so if we don't do that, we are literally saying that we will accept we're going to accept the fact that we're going to have to import our talent, maybe from India and China, because we're literally turning our backs on our own workforce, right? So it is an economic imperative. We will not be able to sustain Social Security funds. We're not going to be able to, be at the cutting edge of technology and innovation if we are literally writing off the majority of our workforce. So I'm convinced that we have got to shift that narrative, because then it doesn't become a partisan issue, it becomes a bipartisan issue. It's an interest that everybody should have, right? And that totally shifts the way that then we will see investments coming in. But that's a tall order, but we have to start somewhere. So that was my first takeaway. My second takeaway is that how many of you have had an opportunity to read perhaps findings from different research all over the country? There are some very famous studies about the importance and the return on early care and education investment. How many of you, just raise your hand, have read about the importance of early care and education and why we have to invest and the best practices and all of that? Okay, so I see that I think the majority of you have done that because this is your field and you want to be informed, right? So there are many, many, many studies, right? There are many jurisdictions who've done really good work, and folks want to highlight them as best practices. What inevitably happens is that any single time you join a work group, a task force, whether it's in a local level, state level, or national level, and I'm sure many of you have participated, I have, in 1,000 million task forces and work groups, and we've had tons and tons and tons of conversations, and we have highlighted and produced a lot of strategic plans, et cetera, et cetera. And where it hits that wall, it's when it comes to the time to talk about funding, right? Funding. So we're going through that right now with the Kerwin Commission, right? So it's always about funding. Yeah, everything is great, everything is beautiful, we're cutting edge, we know what we have to do, wow, it has to be culturally proficient, and then we have to blah, blah, blah. And then it's like, okay, great, that's great, we have a plan. All right, how much is it going to cost to serve X amount of children? Oh, well, that's prohibitive. So my second takeaway was, look, going back to the conversation in that cab, we need dedicated funding streams, period, okay? Miami-Dade has $100 million in a dedicated funding stream called the Children's Trust. I am really jealous about that. Now, in our jurisdiction here in Montgomery County, I don't think we need $100 million because the truth is that in Miami-Dade, when they got started, they didn't have a lot out there in terms of infrastructure. We have a lot more invested. I earlier mentioned all the different centers and initiatives that we have, so we have quite a bit out there, but we need a lot more. Because if you truly are going to make a difference, all you need to do is look at the children that are entering, look at the births that have happened 5 years before, you look at that trend line, and you know that unless you have a significant amount of money, I'm talking like, $25, $30 million, you're not gonna be able to scratch the surface. And you're gonna pay more later on, right? So in terms of sustainability, it just makes total sense to have dedicated funding streams. So those two things are critical. We need to reframe the narrative, and we need to push for dedicated funding streams, right? And those of you who are here, it is very important that wherever you are, whatever locality you're coming from in the area, start looking at that. What is my local government doing, or what's happening on the state level? Where is that dedicated funding stream? Let's advocate for that. Because if we don't try to focus and narrow the direction of where we're going, we're gonna continue to be scattered all over the place, and like that lady was saying in the cab, we have a lot of small programs, but we're not turning, the needle. I joined the Board of Education in 2004. If I pull reports from that time, or even when I was running Centro Familia in the, 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, I can pull reports today, and if I read them, you would think that it was just published 2 weeks ago. It's the same thing. The achievement gap is expanding, there are barriers for low-income families to access quality childcare, and the geographic accessibility. It's the same thing, and I'm really tired of that. This is my last term on the council, so I'm a little bit like, okay, no more. So dedicated funding stream, remember that. So those two things. When you talk about what you do, talk about it from the perspective of it being an economic imperative and a must, and that we need dedicated funding stream. An additional talking point that I can give you is that it has also been framed as a national security issue because there are generals who have put together different organizations around the country and who have been talking about how they can't even find enough folks who can pass the tests that are required to go into these different branches of the military. I'm not a big military person necessarily, I'm not advocating for that, but it is important for our national security, right? So that's another issue that they're looking at, right? The future of our national security, our competitive edge, and why we need to make the appropriate investment. That's what's really critical. I will share with you that in Montgomery County, for example, going back to this notion of what it's needed, there are a number of things that jump out at me. We know that here, a family of 3 with 1 adult, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child needs an income of $86,500, $80 to cover the basic necessities. We know here in Montgomery County, one thing that we did and we led the way was to pass minimum wage to $15, and along with Prince George's County worked together, and now the state is looking at that. But the reality is that even though we did that, a parent with 2 young children would need to work over 155 hours per week at minimum wage to make ends meet. We also know that because, and I mentioned earlier, we have, right now, Latino children make up the largest component in the school system. We also know that this is a real big challenge. Because, as I said earlier, these children are presenting and they're basically alingual. And what that means is it's not like they're speaking Spanish fluently and reading it, for example, and it's not like they're speaking English and reading it. They're literally coming in alingual because they have not been in quality early care and education settings. So all of those things really have significant impact. At this point, 51% of children entering public kindergarten in the county, 51%, are not ready for kindergarten. And it's even lower when it comes to low-income households. For low-income households, it's 70% that are not ready, and for English language learners, it's 74% that are not ready. So we do know that we need to hurry up and do something. So even though we had the recession and even though we didn't have a dedicated funding stream, here in Montgomery County, there were a few items that we were able to push forward. And I worked really hard with my colleagues and was able to get support for a number of things to elevate early care and education as an agenda on the county. We have created, for example, passed a bill where anytime the county is going to build a public facility, we have to do a feasibility study to see if we can co-locate a child care center, because that goes to the issue of capacity. We also worked, and I authored a bill that's called the Childcare Expansion and Quality Enhancement Initiative, and that has resources for family child care providers, that folks are prospective family child care providers, but also created a high-level policy officer position in HHS so that somebody can own this issue, push it through. It also created it called for a strategic plan as well, and that we did. We also created a fund where we can leverage private money in order to scale up best practices, so we've been doing that concurrently. We have also extended half-day Head Start, which is It's kind of crazy, isn't it, that we have all these half-day Head Starts, like how many low-income parents, or just parents in general, have the luxury of just having your child in a half-day program. So we've expanded those to full day, and we are continuing to do that. Now, all of that is to say that, in my opinion, the time has come for Montgomery County to just, get serious. And so I have authored a 4-year action plan, and I have basically focused on the first year, which is this year, for us to, what I call, take advantage of the low-hanging fruit opportunities and put forth a framework that would get us going with the notion that in the second year, we can put a down payment on that dedicated funding stream. And then the third year, we put more money. Fourth year, we should have a substantial dedicated funding stream. And this first year, what I have proposed is that, we expand family childcare providers at those slots in areas of the county where we have gaps, and we have a study that has identified those areas, so we can focus there strategically, and partnering with Montgomery College, our Childcare Resource and Referral Center, Montgomery County Public Schools, we can recruit a cohort of prospective family childcare providers and help them through the entire process, including support after they become licensed to make sure these children are able to be served and connect those parents to subsidies. I'm proposing that we look at our eligibility criteria for our subsidies because there are many families, especially young families, who may not qualify for purchase of care, but they still need some help to afford high-quality childcare. So that's another component. I have proposed that we take a very close look, almost do a census on the available storefront. We have a lot of vacancies, and begin to see if we need to change some zoning or regulations to expand the availability of slots in different parts of the county, taking advantage of our storefronts. Partnering with our faith-based communities who are already doing some of this work, how can we incentivize expansion? Partnering with our private providers, with our community providers, and looking at intergenerational programming, which is so important and so key. We also will continue to monitor the Kerwin Commission. Let's see what might come down our way, and then really work closely with our private sector. And we have an amazing organization, Montgomery Moving Forward, that has started to do that work. And so the first year, at least we can have a very tangible outcome, but also begin to expand the capacity so that year 2, when we have that money, we can start scaling up this vision. Year 2, 3, 4, and then hopefully get at a point where we can start evaluating. And so this is going to be critical, and you will play a really, really important role, because anytime there is an expansion, we need, of course, more people to work in this field. We're going to need mentors, and we'll also need to put front and center, how can we make sure that as a professional, you also have competitive wages, ability to access health care benefits, look at, how can you be supported as a professional. And so it goes hand in hand. And that's the work that we're going to engage, this year. I think that we should have a press conference, hopefully in the next month, working with the executive to make sure everybody's aligned. All my colleagues are absolutely on board. So in so many ways in Montgomery County right now, what's happening is interesting. Other jurisdictions, people have to lobby their the public officials and their elected officials and really shame them, Here is actually the leadership, the executive and the council, and we're all like, yes, let's go do this right now. And in that sense, I think it's exciting because it means that it should be easier to get there and to get there sooner. So those are some of the things that I wanted to share with you today. I applaud you. It's really an honor to be with you. As I say often, I've come into this area of early care and education as a consumer, as an advocate, as a practitioner, and as a policymaker. And I am absolutely convinced that this is the space where we're going to make the difference that we need to make in our communities. So thank you so much.